Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Medieval Worlds of Neil Gaiman, From Beowulf to Sleeping Beauty, by Shiloh Carroll. Narrated by Petrea Burchard. Introduction. Neil Gaiman and Medievalism. A 630-year-old man walks into a Renaissance fair and proceeds to complain that it's not realistic enough. "It's someone's idea of the English Middle Ages crossed with bloody Disneyland," he declares. He fusses to anyone who will listen that there's not enough shit or pox, the beer is too weak, and the minstrels are annoying. Hob Gadling isn't just a cranky old man, he's a cranky old man who has lived through the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, the early modern period, all the way up to the 20th century. His creator, Neil Gaiman, uses him in Sandman to demonstrate how cultural memory storifies the past, particularly the Middle Ages. Gaiman uses Hob to briefly describe medievalism, but there's more to medievalism than misunderstanding the Middle Ages, just as there's more to Neil Gaiman than Sandman. Chances are, if you're into genre fiction at all, and let's be honest, even if you're not, you've heard of Gaiman. In his 40-year career, he has written work that spans media: TV, movies, radio, novels, short stories, graphic novels. Genres: science fiction, fantasy, horror, nonfiction, superheroes, and age ranges: picture books, middle grade, young adult, and adult. His print work has been adapted to television, film, radio, and stage. Some has even crossed media, with prose or poetic works being adapted into graphic novels or illustrated editions. He has been awarded 3 honorary doctorates, 5 Hugos, 2 Nebulas, 4 Bram Stoker Awards, 22 Locus Awards, and Newbery and Carnegie Medals, among dozens of others. Yet he still finds time to interact with 2.9 million Twitter followers, a constant stream of questions on Tumblr, and Q&As at book tours. As the New York Times' Sarah Lyle puts it, Gaiman exists in the center of a rare Venn diagram where best-selling author meets famous personality meets cult figure. Neil Richard Gaiman was born in England in 1960 to a Polish-Jewish family who also practiced Scientology. He has said, however, that he is not a practicing Scientologist and that Judaism is the religion of his family. He learned to read at age 4 and has listed his favorite authors as J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Lewis Carroll. In an interview with his daughter, Maddie, he said that his first piece of writing was a poem composed at age 3, transcribed by his mother. As he grew up, his favorite authors expanded to include Mary Shelley, Rudyard Kipling, Ursula K. Le Guin, and G.K. Chesterton, although Roger Zelazny has had the most direct impact both on his style and career. His writing career began in journalism, not fiction. His first book was a biography of the band Duran Duran, published in 1984, which he has since said he wishes he'd never written, because he wrote it for money that never materialized, and it wasn't even something he'd have read. He continued to work as a journalist for several years, publishing another nonfiction book in 1986, before becoming disillusioned with British journalism and moving more permanently to fiction. Gaiman's first major fiction publications were in comic books. He wrote for several DC Comics series before being hired to resurrect an old character, the Sandman. Instead of the pulp detective version that had previously appeared in Sandman titles, Gaiman created Morpheus, the anthropomorphic representation of dreams, a character far from the usual butt-kicking DC Comics superhero. Gaiman did not expect the series to last long, noting that every comic he had liked working on had been a commercial failure. So he took on big ideas, writing treatments for comic scripts he never thought he'd be allowed to draft. Then, Sandman began selling. It outsold Swamp Thing and Hellblazer, DC Comics' most popular adult titles. Then it outsold Batman and Superman. Between 1991 and 1999, Sandman won 20 Eisner Awards, 4 of those for writing. In 2000, it was nominated for a Hugo for Best Related Work. The success put incredible pressure on Gaiman, who noted, "Sandman has gradually gotten to the point of being what I'm automatically linked to and thought of by people as the creator of." and I know that for my sanity, the story is going to have to end, but that doesn't make it easier." 2 years later, in a 1996 interview, Gaiman worried about his fame and cult appeal, saying he intended to spend a couple of years doing other things and go back to comics when people have forgotten me. Sandman's initial run ended in March 1996 with 75 total issues, and editor Karen Berger made the unprecedented decision to end the series rather than bring on another writer to continue it. Yet, as history has shown, Gaiman was anything but forgotten after leaving Sandman. While writing Sandman, Gaiman was also collaborating with Terry Pratchett on Good Omens, a humorous take on the apocalypse, which was published in 1990. He followed this with his novelization of the TV serial Neverwhere, 1996, which he had also written, while continuing to write and edit comics. Soon after came the novels Stardust, 1999, and American Gods, 2001. Gaiman was now well and truly established. Since then, hardly a year has gone by that hasn't seen some release of his work somewhere, whether in comics, prose, television, film, or radio. He writes original fiction and contributes to established worlds like Doctor Who. He adapts his own work into different formats, Good Omens to television, or allows others to do the same, The Ocean at the End of the Lane to stage. And occasionally he goes back to Sandman and writes another new story for it. The wide variation in Gaiman's work can be explained by his approach to inspiration. Gaiman encourages writers to create a compost heap, somewhere to put small incidents, ideas, people, bits of conversation, and other influences that will blend into a stew that can be used to create stories. This is similar to J.R.R. Tolkien's idea of the soup pot, a simmering vat of stew that collects stories for writers to draw from. Though Tolkien's pot is more universal and historical than Gaiman's more personal compost heap, the idea is basically the same. Inspiration comes from everywhere and everything. Gaiman gathers everything he can as he goes through life and uses it to tell stories. Modern fantasy, possibly more than any other genre, is a compost heap of heavy medieval influences. Gaiman follows a robust and deep tradition of a magical Middle Ages, influenced by people such as J.R.R. Tolkien, William Morris, and Sir Walter Scott. Their influences can be traced back further, through the Brothers Grimm and Sir Thomas Malory, and even into medieval epics such as Beowulf, which itself can be traced even further into Greek and Roman mythology, and so on, back into prehistory. Literature endlessly builds on itself. For the sake of clarity, let me explain a few terms that I'll be using extensively, beginning with the differences between medieval and medievalism. Medieval, or the Middle Ages, refers to the historical time period between about 500 and 1500 CE, along with the era's attendant cultural expressions like literature, politics, and religion. In contrast, medievalism is a post-medieval, after 1500 CE, interpretation of the medieval. Any meaning assigned to medieval culture or texts after the Middle Ages is by definition a medievalist one. People who study the history of the Middle Ages are called medievalists, while something derived from the Middle Ages can be called medievalist. The people who study medievalism are sometimes called medievalismists. One of the earliest examples of such interpretation is Francesco Petrarch's 1304–74, declaring this period the Dark Ages, understood as a time of ignorance and barbarism that descended on the world after the fall of Rome. Dating historical periods can be fuzzy. For Petrarch, the early 14th century was the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. Yet the Middle Ages are considered to continue for another 200 years because the English Renaissance, for example, is dated to the late 15th century. Dating the Middle Ages as 500 CE, the end of the Western Roman Empire, to 1500 CE, around the time Columbus sailed for the Americas, is fairly arbitrary. Petrarch's declaration tells us more about his own prejudices than it does about the Middle Ages. But projecting assumptions backward is a core facet of medievalism. Academics will also often distinguish between medievalism and neo-medievalism. The latter, much slipperier term is usually used for even less medieval medievalism, like fantasy novels that get their version of the Middle Ages from Tolkien, or purposefully inaccurate or playful portrayals of the Middle Ages, such as the 2001 film A Knight's Tale, or the ABC TV series Gallivant, 2015 to 2016. Just to keep things from getting too muddy, I use medievalism for any post-medieval period interpretation of the medieval period or medieval culture. None of these terms is meant judgmentally. Neo-medievalism isn't worse medievalism. The terms exist to help explain how many levels of separation sit between a text, or cultural phenomenon, or idea, and the historical Middle Ages. For the purposes of this book, I care very little about accuracy in Gaiman's portrayal of the Middle Ages, mostly because Gaiman isn't usually attempting any, but also because a fully accurate portrayal of the Middle Ages in fantasy is impossible. Fantasy is transformative. It's meant to ask what-if questions and introduce magic into an unmagical system. Also, there are so many layers of history, literature, art, and architecture, among other artifacts, between now and the Middle Ages that it's nearly impossible to put ourselves into the mindset of a person from the Middle Ages. And this isn't even getting into the problem of referring to a 1,000-year, multi-country, multi-continent span of time as though it were a single unified era and culture. Western fantasy literature is deeply medievalist. Early influences in the genre came from courtly romances, especially Arthurian romances, and Celtic fairy stories. Early modern writers such as Edward Spencer, The Faerie Queene, 1590, Charles Perrault, Histories or Tales of Past Times, 1697, and even Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1594, pulled on these medieval stories for their works. In the Gothic tradition, which began around 1760, medievalism was more overtly political. Writers such as Horace Walpole, The Castle of Otranto, 1764, projected their distrust in Enlightenment ideas backward into a vague idea of the Middle Ages, the dark, gritty version, in order to avoid falling prey to sedition acts. The pendulum swung the other way for the Romantics, who saw a much more beautiful and sublime Middle Ages. Writers and artists such as John Keats, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Blake influenced the genre with epic language, exoticism, and bright colors. All these laid the foundation for arguably the most influential medievalismists of the Victorian era, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of artists, writers, poets, amateur historians, and models whose aesthetic was purposefully medieval. They saw themselves as a second round table, a model of chivalry, courage, loyalty, and mutual support. The Brotherhood produced works such as Christina and Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Goblin Market, 1862, John Everett Millais' painting Ophelia, 1852, and the many and varied works of William Morris. Pre-Raphaelites and artists connected to the Pre-Raphaelites have been listed as influences on Lord Dunsany, The King of Elfland's Daughter, 1924, J.R.R. Tolkien, and C.S. Lewis. Because of these medievalisms, various ideas and beliefs about the Middle Ages, as well as style, themes, motifs, and symbols attributed, however correctly or incorrectly, to the period, have been baked into fantasy literature. Even urban fantasy borrows medievalisms. Fairies, occultism, and vampires dominate the genre. This is the environment Gaiman is writing in, a multi-layered, pseudo-historical, sometimes contradictory semi-medieval fantasy tradition. Although Gaiman's approach doesn't quite reach outright medieval high fantasy, by which I mean the kind of medieval we see in, say, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, it is no less medievalist for all that. Gaiman's influences are many, varied, and layered. But as I'll demonstrate in the following chapters, medieval and medievalist traditions heavily influence nearly all his work. Yet, his work is also distinctly modern. He expertly blends medievalist tropes and themes with current ones, creating stories that consciously borrow from and build on all the stories that have influenced him over the years. Recognizing these influences, both direct and abstract, can deepen and enrich a reader's appreciation of his work. Let's dig deep into Gaiman's compost heap and explore the foundational medieval and medievalist influences on some of his most popular works. These ancient texts still impact our literature today. Chapter 1. Sandman and Everyman. Morpheus, Lord of Dream, Prince of Stories, son of time and night, billions of years old and unbelievably powerful, is sulking. Having been freed from a 70-year imprisonment at the hands of a sorcerer and then the sorcerer's son, he has faced down rogue dreams, hell itself, and an escapee from Arkham Asylum to regain the trappings of his power. Now, quest over, he sits in a city square, feeding the birds, and sulking. This is where his sister, Death, finds him. She gives him a good scolding. "You are literally the stupidest, most self-centered, appallingest excuse for an anthropomorphic personification on this or any other plane." While Morpheus's nature as Lord of Dream has been indicated in earlier issues, this is the first time in Sandman that the phrase anthropomorphic personification is used to describe Morpheus and his siblings. It won't be the last. Much of the series is an exploration of what it means to be an allegory and the personification of an idea, as well as what the rules and responsibilities for them are. Intertwined with the lives of the endless are the lives, struggles, and lessons of mortals, all contributing to the life and ultimately death of Morpheus, Lord of Dreams. Interaction between humans and personified virtues, vices, and ideas has a long, rich literary and dramatic history. In late medieval, early Tudor England, a specific genre of drama sprang up in response to a variety of religious and social pressures, the morality play. Several of them are still available to us today. The one most frequently anthologized for high school and college literature texts is The Summoning of Everyman. But just as important and useful for this discussion are The Castle of Perseverance and Mankind. Morality plays had several unifying features: a core, Christian moral lesson, allegorical personifications of human traits and external pressures, and instructions for living well so that one could also die well. These plays forced an avatar of humankind, Everyman, Humanum Genus, and Mankind, respectively, to face their own faults, sins, and virtues as a warning to the audience. Death can come at any time, they warn. Have you lived your life so that you're ready? Gaiman does not overtly embrace a single religious worldview in Sandman, but the series has notable similarities in structure, theme, and motifs to medieval morality plays. The most obvious is the endless themselves, anthropomorphic personifications of human impulses and psyche. But Sandman also contains a core moral lesson intertwined with various approaches to facing death. Death is the inevitable ultimate end for everything and everyone, even the endless. Gaiman describes the basic plot of Sandman as the Lord of Dreams learns that one must change or die, and makes his decision. Morality plays explored the effects of one's actions in life on the outcome of one's death, and in its way, Sandman does the same, but with enough modern storytelling to keep Morpheus from being simply a flat allegory. He is both allegory and compelling character, a skillful use of medieval tropes updated for a modern audience's expectations. Moral lessons. Morality plays were tools for teaching a largely illiterate populace about the various pitfalls that could prevent them from reaching heaven after death. Religious and political pressure heavily influenced the vices illustrated on stage. After all, this was a time of serious social upheaval. The Protestant Reformation was on the horizon, and feudalism was collapsing. As medievalist John Watkins explains, morality playwriters adopted allegory as their basic mode because its subordination of the particular to the universal mirrored the hierarchies of an imagined feudal polity that equated social aspiration with pride. the playwrights discouraged the idea of social mobility and insisted on a predetermined social structure. Not only did morality plays reinforce certain religious concepts, they also used allegories for feudal structures as a foundation to illustrate humankind's relationship with God, and in turn to hint at a divine endorsement for the feudal system itself. For example, the primary antagonists in the medieval morality play Mankind are mischief, naught, nowadays, and new guise, fashion. Using these personifications, the play warns against novelty and idleness. Ultimately, the distraction vices are replaced by a literal devil, serving to show that a fascination with the things of the world leads to damnation. The Castle of Perseverance focuses more broadly on the 7 deadly sins, casting the struggle for humanum genus as a siege in which the everyman is mostly a spectator, not being a knight or lord, rather than an active participant in the battle. And every man relies heavily on the language of accounting. Every man must balance his ledger before he dies to show that he has been responsible with his life and earned his place in heaven. Much of the political and social overtones of these morality plays has been lost to time, as so much of the medieval mindset has been. While modern readers might see every man as an overly simplistic, heavy-handed allegory, medievalist V.A. Colve has teased out layers of meaning that would have been evident to its original audience. That is to say, anyone familiar with the parable of the talents from Matthew chapter 25 and its commentaries from writers like St. Jerome. Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30, recounts Jesus telling his followers that the kingdom of God is like a man who goes on a journey, leaving his servants with various amounts of money. When he returns, 2 of them have doubled their money and are praised as good and faithful servants. The third hides his in the ground and is scolded because he could at least have put it in the bank and gotten interest back. The implication is that the servant is sent to hell. Without these stories and analyses in the common zeitgeist, we lose the experience and understanding of these plays that the medieval viewer would have had. However, even if most of the original context and intertextuality, that is, the interplay of the text in question and its predecessors and how that interplay helps to shape the meaning of the text, of these plays is no longer accessible, except to those who study medieval writings, their core moral lessons are still visible. Similarly, Sandman is heavily intertextual, so much so that between 2012 and 2015, DC Comics released a 4-volume set of the annotated Sandman, in which Leslie Klinger meticulously documented thousands of references to other works, historical events, philosophies, and others. Despite this plethora of antecedents and sources, a core moral is evident in the series. In Mankind, the playwright warns us that constant vigilance is necessary to hold off evil. This lesson is achieved through rampant chaos and distraction on stage, as well as purposeful nonsense words and phrases meant to undermine mercy's preaching and advice. Naught, nowadays, and new guys tease Mercy for being a stick in the mud with his flowery language and knowledge of Latin. "Hey, you, translate this into Latin," Nowadays says, roughly glossed. "I have eaten a dishful of curds, and I have shit, or shut, your mouth full of turds." The worldlings, as the 3 are called, also use Latin, the language of the church, to say things like, "kiss my ass," and echo the language of confession and penance for further rude instructions. Pope Pocket guarantees that if you put your nose in his wife's socket, vagina, you will have 40 days of pardon. The staging is purposeful, it distracts, and thus condemns the audience as well. It takes only a moment of distraction for mankind to fall prey to the demon Titivilus. He then requires re-educating by mercy before the play's end. A similar theme emerges in the early issues of Sandman. In the first major arc, Preludes and Nocturnes, issues 1 to 8, Morpheus is captured by human mages and imprisoned for 72 years. During this time, several of his more terrible nightmares, the Corinthian, Brute, and Glob, get loose and begin terrorizing humans. A good bit of the second major arc, The Doll's House, issues 9 to 16, follows Morpheus as he rounds up and defeats his creations. Several plot and character elements of these issues of Sandman show interesting parallels with mankind. Morpheus's imprisonment was possible in the first place because he was exhausted after fixing a rift in the space-time continuum, much like mankind's distraction comes when Titivilus steals his spade while he's working. The escaped nightmares Glob and Brute are trying to build their own version of Morpheus's realm, the Dreamtime, in the mind of a traumatized boy, in hopes of creating and ruling a new Dreamtime through a surrogate. Like mankind's worldlings, Brute and Glob are given less sophisticated speech mannerisms. "Festering scabs," Glob complains when Morpheus finds them. "Pus and pox and puke on it all. We came so damned close. Just a few more years, it would have worked." The Corinthian is much more articulate and a bigger threat than Brute and Glob. Rather than confining his influence to a single boy, he has been influencing and inspiring serial killers across America. He tells them that they are special, warriors and artists, above the rest of humankind. When Morpheus removes him, they lose their confidence and slink back into the darkness. Hunting the escaped nightmares is simultaneously a distraction from and inextricably linked to Morpheus's quest to find the dream vortex, which could destroy the boundaries between the Dreamtime and the real world. The Endless as allegorical personification. Probably the most famous contemporary example of allegorical fiction is The Chronicles of Narnia, 1950 to 56. C.S. Lewis's portal fantasy series that places Christian theology in a world of high magic, complete with creation story, sacrificial god, and Armageddon. Of course, allegorical personification is an ancient storytelling and rhetorical device, one far predating Lewis. Modern authors use it differently than medieval authors and playwrights. Medievalist Pamela King points out that while allegories such as John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, 1678, and George Orwell's Animal Farm, 1945, have literal storylines that are separable from their message, in medieval morality plays, the storylines are the actualization on stage of their moral sentence or lesson. In other words, while we can read modern allegories just for the story while ignoring the deeper lesson, in morality plays, the story is literally the lesson, so no separation is possible. The central conceit of these plays is giving ideas, qualities, and human attributes a body and letting them speak for themselves. In Everyman, characters such as death, fellowship, and good deeds discuss the fate of every man who is attempting to find someone to accompany him on a pilgrimage, death, from which he will never return. In Mankind, new guys, not and nowadays attempt to turn mankind to sin and suicide against the advice of mercy. And in The Castle of Perseverance, Humanum genus is placed in a castle and defended from the 7 deadly sins by the 7 moral virtues. In short, the drama of morality plays was personified virtues and vices, contending over passive protagonists incapable of understanding or ameliorating their circumstances. While to modern audiences these plays read as unsophisticated and naive, their use of allegory was seen to serve an important purpose. As cognition and literature scholar Jean Bocharova puts it, personification in the Middle Ages embodied ideas, and, in the most basic sense, were seen as either making those ideas more palatable, more easily comprehended, or as veiling them in obscurity, both as protection against profane minds and as a reward for the worthy. In other words, allegorical personification helped to clarify some fairly complicated religious ideas, but only for those who were ready and willing to understand them. Comprehending the allegory was its own reward. Allegorical personification is not unique to medieval morality plays, but actually a fundamental way the human brain understands concepts. For example, justice as a blindfolded woman with a sword and scales. In Sandman, Gaiman creates a family of anthropomorphized ideas, who are fully aware of their status as such. They are called the Endless: dream, destiny, death, desire, delirium, despair, and destruction. The endless rule over their respective realms and interact with humans, and sometimes non-humans, such as fairies, cats, gods, and stars. Like the personifications in morality plays, they represent fundamental and constant aspects.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?